Hi, everybody. Welcome to Reading as a Social Activity. One of the authors of one of the things you can read as an optional today states that he believes that the day of reading by yourself in a corner all curled up is ending rapidly. And I don't think I believe that. I will always, I think, love reading by myself in a corner all curled up or curled up in bed or whatever. But it is true that reading seems to be becoming much more social with the advent primarily of technology networks. But honestly, if we look back to the earliest memories we have of reading, reading has always been social. Because often our very first experiences with reading were with our parents. And for the kids lucky enough to have that experience, part of the whole reading thing was being held, cuddling up next to your mom and dad, spending time with your mom or dad, talking about the book, enjoying it. So our first experiences with reading are very rarely isolated in any way. But what's interesting and what we often forget is that family is still very important to teenagers. Now, we all know how important it is to read to kids, and I didn't even include any articles in here on that. If you want some to share with parents, I can certainly find them for you. But we all know that kids that get read to learn to read more easily. They understand books. They know how books work. They understand written language, which is different from oral language, as we pointed out last time we met. They get enticed into books. If your major memory of books is being warm and being held and laughing together, well, that's a real good introduction, isn't it? But like I said, research has been showing us that even adolescents, their family continues to influence their reading. And adolescents, when they're asked who recommends books, name their parents almost as often as their peers, which is really interesting. And especially adolescents really like to share what they're reading with their families. So very often, if a parent is open to it, a teen will come and say, "Here, I just read this. You really have to read this book." And instead of making fun of them for loving Twilight, which I know is difficult, the wise parent reads the book and talks about it and doesn't run it down. Although they might say, "Well, excuse me, if you like Twilight, maybe here's this other book you'll like." So they like to show us what they're reading. And interestingly, it turns out boys are especially influenced by fathers that read. This guy down in the corner, you can see them. Two guys reading by themselves, right? On the bench next to each other. And guys whose fathers read for recreation and also who share what they read with their sons are much more likely to become readers than boys who don't have that modeling and sharing. So family is key to reading and literacy development from the very earliest all the way through adolescence. And I have to tell you, my son's 30 and we still share books. He recently, last Christmas, gave me the first five of the Dresden Files in Amazon for Christmas. I'd never read those. He talked me into it. I read them all like in a week because they were great. So we talk about books all the time. And many, many families still do that. Okay, so that's one way that reading is inherently social. And there's actually two different ways to talk about how reading and literacy in general is social. And the one we just talked about is that social interaction encourages reading. Okay, and this is when we think about reading being social, this is usually what we think about, social interaction leading to reading. And so in the exploration, the investigation books, not books, I'm sorry, the investigation sites and articles and things for this week, you're going to bump into a lot of possible social activities that promote reading. Of course, the classic here on the upper left is the book club. And I'm not talking about what they've called a book club in classes where kids have to read a book and they have to ask each other questions and they're assigned certain roles. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about real book clubs, the kind that grown-ups have, where everybody gets together and reads a book and talks about it and enjoys it. Okay? That is certainly one of the best ways to promote reading that we know. But we can start doing this kind of stuff online too, which is really interesting. So I've given you a list of online social networking sites that you can use within your school. Goodreads, for example, and Shelfari both, you can have a protected circle where the Goodreads and everything, for example, is only the kids in your school can access it, or their parents and them, or whoever you decide. And Shelfari works the same way. But there are ways for kids to share what they love with each other. And of course, if you want to break out into the bigger world, um, kids can write reviews of books on a number of sites, the Teen Reads site, a number of the ALA sites, and Amazon, of course, is the king of book reviews. And you know, it is really exciting for a kid, whether they're a fourth grader or a junior in high school, to write a review on Amazon and have a whole bunch of people read it. I mean, that's real literacy, isn't it? Okay, and another thing that's going on, which is getting really interesting, is that the people who are making ebooks and e-documents are building in a lot of sharing options, one of which is you can highlight in the document and then you can choose to share your highlighting either with a small group of people or with the world. And Kindle now has that possibility. So you'll see something that says 4 other people highlighted this part of the book. So for example, you could see how if you're reading a textbook, being able to see where other people highlighted it might help you. And that's a different kind of social reading, but it's there. Personally, it would drive me nuts. I'd hate to see other people's highlights, but a lot of people like it. Okay, so that's one way, social interaction promoting reading and literacy. But there's another way to think about that, a specific kind of social interaction, and that is having an audience. And we talked about that just a little bit ago with the book reviews. You know, knowing that other people are reading your review on Amazon is the kick to it, isn't it? But we can get authentic audiences lots of other ways. And I want you to notice a few things here. See that little pencil over there? That's telling you that writing is coming into this. For example, you don't just read the book, you write your review on Amazon, don't you? So a lot of times when we start to do authentic, real things with reading, we end up writing too. Reading and writing are two halves of the same coin, and they go together really well. Okay, but do you see that arrow that's going down? Well, in a few more slides, you're going to see that arrow showing up, because authentic audience also leads to a different kind of social reading. But for a while here, let's look at some different ways that you can have authentic audiences in reading. And you're going to watch 3 of these for, like, everybody's going to watch those. And then the other 2 are optionals. One video that you're going to watch is about a teacher who has found a way to develop authentic audiences for what his students write, authentic audiences from all over the world. And another one you're going to watch is Brett Dillingham. He's down in the bottom left here. And he runs storytelling workshops with emotionally and behaviorally disabled kids. And it is an amazing video. I think you're going to love it. And then another amazing video is the Poetry Project, which is people who do high school kids who develop spoken poetry and perform. And they have a little bit of a social goal. Now, 2 other things that are in the investigatory ones, not the ones everybody's going to read, but the ones you get to choose, is an article about how high school newspapers have been expanded to serve their communities. And I mentioned that in our meeting tonight, is that one of the things that, I think I mentioned it anyway, one of the things that happens in rural communities very often is that the local newspaper goes under. The newspapers, because people aren't reading newspapers as much anymore, and so newspapers aren't commercially viable in a lot of small communities, but something happens to a community when it loses its newspaper. And what happens is there's nowhere to post local classified ads. There's nowhere to advertise for employment. There's nowhere for local stores to advertise to the community. So more and more the community loses business to the big towns at a distance. There's nowhere for announcements of weddings and births and graduations. There's nowhere for the school news. So the community loses an important part of their heart, the thing that holds them together. And a guy from Alabama, Jack Shelton, ran a program called Pacers, and one of the things he did out of University of Alabama was work with rural Alabama high schools for their newspaper club, not to produce some school newspaper that only the kids read, but to take on producing the community newspaper. So the kids got incredibly good experience. It didn't cost any more than running a school newspaper. In fact, it cost less because they got real ads and they got real people taking subscriptions, but they didn't have to make money the way a commercial newspaper would have to because it was a class. So they could afford to kind of break even and maybe sometimes get a little subsidy. And the kids got incredible experience so that when they went out to college and they could say they had been a feature editor or a photographer or whatever for a real newspaper with real circulation, that was worth a lot. So it was kind of a win for everybody. And that's a type of authentic audience, to publish to your community. You can also, there's not a picture here for it, and there's not an article, but you can certainly, kids can actually publish books. And I think that Christy Desmet's going to talk about that a little bit more when she looks at writing. And another way to get authentic audiences is to have pen pals, to correspond back and forth in writing with people in other communities, other states, and other countries. And there are a number of sites that do this. Probably the best known and the most respected is called ePals. And again, I've watched that. I've worked with teachers who did that, and it is amazing. They write back and forth to kids in total other countries, and what they learn and how carefully they write is so cool. The first video you're going to watch about transforming teaching and learning with authentic audiences, they go into, the sound isn't as great as it should be on that one, and it's not like wonderfully produced. But why I keep it is because they talk about why authentic audience makes a difference, and the kids talk about it. So if I'm writing something for my teacher, all I'm trying to do is to get a grade, if I care about the grade, which a whole lot of kids don't. Okay? But if I'm writing something that someone else is gonna read, someone across the world, then I'm going to write it carefully. If I'm writing something I'm going to post on Amazon, I'm going to write it carefully. I'm going to go back over it. If I'm writing poetry that I'm going to perform for the community, I'm going to pay attention. And I'm going to try to get it just right. So that's what authentic audiences and, in a bigger sense, authentic tasks do for learning. An authentic task is An authentic learning task is an activity for learning that you do, that people do for another purpose too. In other words, if you are running a pretend business in your accounting class, well, that's kind of neat and it's kind of interesting, but you don't learn as much as if you really run the school store. Because if you really run the school store, the accounting matters, doesn't it? If you make a mistake in the accounting, you can screw the whole thing up. If you buy something that's too expensive, you can lose money. If you don't price your pencils at the right price, you won't sell any. So you learn so much more when what you're doing has a purpose beyond just learning. It helps learning, but if that's your only purpose, then you don't learn as much. And this is the power of authentic tasks. And in literacy, one of the ways that makes something authentic is to have a real audience. It is probably one of the best ways. Okay, now let's talk about a different way that reading can be very social, though. And more we're discovering that reading and literacy can be used to help us reach social goals. So not only can social interaction promote reading, but vice versa, reading can help us reach social goals. And the video that you will watch on the poetry project is edging in that direction. Those kids have a purpose for what they're doing beyond just performing and enjoying it. They have a message. And in fact, the kind of social goals that we know that reading and literacy can contribute to are at least three different kinds. We have evidence that reading helps people's social development. And one of the optional articles is by Berglund, and it talks about the evidence that we now have from neurology and psychology showing that people who read fiction become more empathetic. They're better at stepping into other people's shoes. And we've seen this over and over again in school. Like right now, given all the rhetoric that's going on about Muslims, if you were able to have a class or a group in your school that read a book by a young Muslim talking about her life or his life and what it's like living in Palestine or Libya or Syria or one of those torn up countries, don't you think your kids would start looking at that whole Muslim issue very differently than they do now? Because when you read about somebody and it's well written and you get into their lives, you can't say that they're other anymore. You can't pretend that they're all horrible, don't we care about across the world, never mind, not like us people. And so we have, as I said, solid evidence from research, but I think that good teachers and good librarians have always known that, and that's one of the reasons that they recommend books. And one of the ways in terms of helping social development, one of your investigatory book articles is about using books as bibliotherapy. More and more psychologists and counselors are discovering that kids that they have trouble reaching about kids who are drug addicted, kids who come from very difficult homes, kids who've been abused, kids who have chronic illnesses. One of the ways to help them therapeutically is for them to read about kids in similar situations. Or for that matter, kids who are angry all the time and have trouble getting along with other kids, kids who have one of the better uses of bibliotherapy is if you have a kid with a problem in a classroom, then having a book about a kid with that problem helps the rest of the class understand what's going on with that kid. This is one of the things librarians can offer teachers, because teachers aren't going to know that there are books out there about kids with ADHD or chronic illnesses or diabetes or anger issues or who knows. They're not going to know, but you can help them find those books, and their kids can have a wider and more inclusive view of humanity. So social development is one of the things that we know that reading helps us do. Helping other people, we can use reading to help others. And we're going to look at a few things for that. The Reading Buddies article, which is one of your choose one, your exploratory options. I don't know what to call those. Your find two articles is a way for an older struggling reader to help younger struggling readers. And so I think you'll find that's very interesting. And then, of course, we can use literacy to change the world. And there's that pencil again saying that a lot of changing the world has to do with reading and writing. And so, without further ado, let's look at your find, to, and share articles. So basically what you're going to be doing is reading a real short and very cool graphic article on book clubs. A particular kind of book club, but it kind of gives you the whole general idea of book clubs really well. And then you're going to be watching 3 videos about authentic audience and 3 very different ways to reach, and with different populations, authentic audiences with reading. And then, then you're going to pick 2 of these articles or videos or whatever's they are, okay? And that's why this little guy is standing here with the arrows, because he's a little puzzled, and you may be too. So explore around, find two that appeal to you. Okay, there's a whole slew of them. And this is what I was telling you tonight. Find what you're interested in. So if you're really interested in connecting with families, we've got 5 really great things here talking about how you could do that. There's an article by Pat Edwards. It's a very well-known, it's a classic article, set empowering low-income parents to read with young children. Because as several of you pointed out tonight, very often low-income parents or parents who themselves were not great readers don't know how to read with their kids, and they don't feel comfortable with it. So that perpetuates, and their kids have the same disadvantage as they did. So Pat Edwards is an African-American researcher. This is the work she made her reputation on. And she was just past president of the Literacy Research Association. She's a major figure in the field, and this is where she started. Zeiss and Wallace talk about a program they call BAGS, which is Books and Good Stuff, which is a strategy you could use through the library, or you could help teachers use to build homeschool literacy connections. It's really cool. That's for little kids, by the way. The Iowa Commission for Libraries has a site for hosting a family reading night at your school. Some of you said you've tried that and you can't get anyone to come. I can understand how that can happen, but in other communities that might work out really well. Findley's article is on the Big Read, which is librarians you've all heard about, but this is the middle school style. And I think a lot of times we think of the Big Read in elementary school, but not so much in middle school. And they brought parents into it. It became a much deeper, cooler, bigger thing than it is in elementary school, because middle school is different from elementary school. And then Avery has the Bilingual Bag, a middle school family reading project, a way especially to reach in middle school, and you could use it in upper elementary. All of this stuff is, the level can be shifted some, to reach the families of kids who are not native English speakers, because again, those parents often do not feel connected to school, do not feel that they can help their kids with school in any way. And so this is one way to connect. Now, if you're real interested in how to make it social in school itself, the article by Rocco, it's a piece online by Rocco, a blog, Schools That Read Together. All different ways to get the kids in your school talking to each other about reading. And it's great. It's got lots of possibilities in it. The Great Kids site has a whole thing on how to start book clubs for kids. So if you did the Bluford, if you're all going to read the Bluford High article, and if that appeals to you, if you think, hey, I'd like to start a book club, there's a place to start. Withers has a really great article on reading buddies. Now, reading buddies are when you take an older, typically middle school or high school, or maybe 5th grade, struggling reader, and they read with somebody much younger than them. So a 5th grader might read with a 1st grader or a kindergartner. A middle schooler might read with a 2nd or 3rd grader. High schoolers might read with 2nd, 3rd, or 4th graders. It is a really neat way to do it. Now, Withers has a bunch of suggestions for what to do. When we look at struggling readers, I have a program called the Reading Apprenticeship that I shared with you right at the very first session, that little one page, but you'll have the whole article when we look at struggling readers if you want it. And to my mind, that is the #1 best way to do reading buddies, okay? There's a lot of other things they talk about, choral reading and echo reading, but those things are very unnatural. And the apprenticeship reading is just real natural, real normal. You're going to think, why on earth did somebody name this? Well, I named it because I had to study it. People talk about it all the time, but we didn't have as many statistics. So Withers talks about establishing a reading buddies program. And if that's what you think you might be interested, you might like that. I've got a list here of different online social networks for readers and writers. Obviously, you're not going to look at all of them. Pick one to look at, whether it's Shelfari or Goodreads or one of the other ones. And if the dogs that I talked about appealed to you, Here we have the article, Man's Best Friend is Reading Facilitator. And also there's a great video from the librarian 2 years ago who brought the dogs in, and she has a short video of those kids reading with those dogs. And if you don't do anything else about that, watch that video because it'll just make you smile. Okay, other areas. What about if you're interested in reaching out to the community a little more? Wow. Well, Aldrich has an article on little free libraries, and I think you've probably heard of them. Talks about how to put one out in your community. That makes a great project from a library to put a little free library out in the community, someplace it's needed, and it also helps the kids from your school in that community. Loveland has a great article, another real short one on Rural Youth Take Action. She gave a bunch of kids in her school cameras and pencils and paper, and they went out and they took pictures of where their school needed to be fixed and where it needed changes, and they wrote letters and they made presentations, and they got more school funding for their school. They took action. There's the article by Stanler on the school papers serving rural communities, serving as the paper for a whole community, from the New York Times. The article by Powell, Saving Black Mountain, is about a class full of fourth graders who, through their research and writing and advocacy and presentation, actually changed what happened in a coal mining community on their mountain. And it's a longer article, but it's one of the best I've ever read in terms of what kids really can do. It reminds you a lot of what Shelley Wright's kids did, although honestly, for fourth graders, these kids were even more amazing. So if you have a chance to read that, it's one of my favorite articles. I almost made it required, but then I decided not to. So it's up to you. And then there's also, from a book, a chapter with a whole lot of examples of how schools can do projects in the community that are learning projects too. And I want to point this out. Every one of these things helps kids learn the things we want them to learn, the things the standards cover. Okay? But they also make a difference in the world. Now, if the performance stuff was interesting to you, there's one on poetry events, how to do it. And by the way, the same things would apply. You don't have to make it poetry. People can stand up and read short stories that they wrote. You can also just have a coffee house event where people read other people's poetry or books that they really love. Okay? It doesn't have to be self-composed. And then there's a great TEDx from a spoken word poet named Sarah Kay, and she uses some of her poetry but also talks about how she became a spoken word poet and why it matters. And that's another one of those ones you're going to watch and it's just going to make you smile. It's worth watching. If you don't get to watch it now, watch it over the weekend, watch it sometime because it's just really good. The bibliotherapy article by Allen, The Power of Story, is there. So basically, you get to decide your path this time. We're all reading one very short graphic article, partly because I love the format and it shows you what you can do with a format like that. We're all watching three great videos, but then after that, you're dispersing. And what I'm going to ask you to do is find two that interest you. They don't have to be in the same category. They can be. I don't care. Find two that interest you. Read them or watch them. And then post to that discussion board, please, a paragraph on each of them about how you might use that or something like it in your library. I want you to be thinking, what could I do? Now, you might not do exactly the same thing. Like I said, the poetry events one is about people reading their own poetry, but you might decide to have a nonfiction event or a news event or a fiction tasting event or whatever. One of the librarians I was just working with this spring had decided to have a book tasting. And I don't know where she got that idea, but it's a really neat idea. And so there's all kinds of ways you can take these and permute them and change them and twist them and turn them around a little to fit exactly what your kids need. So find yourself two, read them or watch them, write about them, paragraph each on the discussion board, please. And then be prepared to share your ideas when we get together on Thursday. Thank you very much, and you have a good couple of nights. Bye.